Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of our Scholar Spotlight series with Dr. Aaron Simmons. Yes, how to overcome a selfie culture or overcome selfishness, my apologies, in a selfie culture. Uh, Dr. Simmons was born near the Hiawassee River in Tennessee, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Grew up near the beaches of Florida and now lives in the Carolina mountains. Simmons paid his way through college by working construction and playing drums professionally, which I appreciate so much. Is now a professor of philosophy at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and specializes in philosophy of religion, existentialism, and phenomenology. Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and yield the floor to you. Please take it away.
It is my absolute pleasure. Thanks, Animal, for having me, and to everyone else involved in the Lawn Share Philosophy Group. It really is an honor to be with you, and it's super cool to see public philosophy happening in these sorts of ways. And so, whatever encouragement and hell yes that I can say from the wings, please consider them said. So, super excited to be with you. And when I was invited to speak, I guess, impetus was I had done a video on my YouTube channel about Emmanuel Levinas, and to my perplexed, utter surprise, that video has been far and away the best performing video of the 200 and some I have done. And it really blew me away because Levinas is not a thinker that I find lots of traction with people being interested in popular society. There are no plane trips where they say, what do you do? Like, oh, I'm a Levinas scholar. And they say, and follow up, right? It's like, oh, how nice. And back they go to their headphones. So it was really cool to, not just get invited here, but like 4 or 5 different podcasts and groups invited me just on that Levinas talk. And so it's always a thrill to talk about Levinas to broader audiences and try to encourage folks to dig into a philosopher who, though has received lots of attention in a very small space, I think deserves broader attention for all of us as we try to navigate a increasingly politically divided and difficult social life. And so I'm going to try my best to introduce Levinas, but in a slightly broader context, and think about Levinas as a resource for responding to what we might see as just broader philosophical questions or moral issues that we face just as lived social beings. And so what you're going to get is Levinas, but filtered through my own vision of how we should do ethics. And so that's going to be sort of the task I set for myself. It will probably go about 40 minutes presentation. So if any of you have comments or questions kind of in clarificatory ways, please drop them in the Q&A or chat or whatever. And that way I can try to tweak things as I go to respond and make sure nobody is confused or lost. And at the end, we'll dig into the weeds, and anybody who wants to really kind of drill down on the phenomenology, we can do that at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can all see the presentation that I'll be working with. A few years ago, I decided that almost every presentation I had ever heard in philosophy was one that I thought would have been better had a paper not been read. So though I have no hate for people like reading papers, I still do it from time to time. I have increasingly decided that what we should do is find a way to present ideas, and then the papers get published, and for people who want to kind of dig into them, they can check it out in that more formal way. So mine's going to be a presentation, not an actual paper. All right. So in order to overcome selfishness in a selfie culture, what I'm going to suggest is that we do this by starting out thinking about philosophical ethics more broadly. And when we talk about philosophical ethics, it's actually important to understand that philosophical ethics is essentially a way of understanding a distinction between what we would call the is and the ought, or between description and normativity. So I like to think about this as a difference between a college administrator or admissions director and a college faculty member. So the is the way that the admissions person sells you the college, right? We prepare you for the real world, they say. And all the faculty respond, no, we don't. We invite you to consider what world should be made real. that the point of college is not just preparing you to accept what's given, but interrogate what's given and think about what could be. And so in order to think about ethics as that ought space, about what might be the case for us, let's start with what we take to be true about us, maybe with some shame. So I think where we find ourselves is what I'm calling a selfie culture. And this selfie culture is ultimately defined by a very particular emphasis on one's own identity, one's own priorities, and one's own good as actually dictating how one lives, believes, navigates the world. So in order to think about selfie culture, we've got to start realizing that selfies are a physical manifestation, or I might say a phenomenological performance of the way that when we focus on selfishness or my identity as the criterion for everything else, it almost always is going to come at some costs that we probably don't want to pay. And this is why selfie fails just crack me up, because when you look at selfie fails, what they almost always involve is either you making yourself look foolish, or in fact, your perceived sense of greatness coming at the cost of someone else who's just sort of utterly perplexed by the fact that this is how you've decided to navigate the world. So who are we in light of this selfie culture? I want to suggest that who we are increasingly isolated, sterile, anxious, and depressed people. And this then contributes to and underwrites lots of what we now would describe as a divided culture, right? Because when we are now so isolated, so anxious about the way that we are perceived by others, that we then have to always take the selfie, put it through the filter, make sure everybody thinks that we are not only beautiful, but also really, really happy. And this then masks our ability to be open and engaged and honest about certain types of struggles and, the human condition that we share. This then leads to a really deeply troubling reality where we try to gravitate to those people that reinforce that narrative we are trying to concoct. And so the echo chamber phenomenon, the radical group polarization phenomenon, all of that is just sort of outgrowths of what I'm describing as this broader selfie culture. Now, I am a musician, I'm a professional drummer, and so I'm going to do my best to try to say, hey, if all the philosophy kind of leaves you cold, I'm going to give you some signposts along the way that maybe will make these big ideas make a little bit more practical sense. So if you think of selfie culture as a song, I think it sounds like Post Malone's Wow. I'm not going to play these for you because then YouTube won't let them post it later because it will violate copyright. But look at some of what Post Malone claims in this track. She said she tired of little money, need a big boy, pull up 20-inch blades like I'm Lil Troy. Now it's everybody flocking, need a decoy. Shawty mixing up the vodka with the LaCroix. Yeah. And here is some really sophisticated wordplay. G-Wagon, 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 G-Wagon. Like, notice what's occurring, right? Post Malone's presenting himself as something that is presented for the consumption of others, right? Everybody else is consuming him as their ideal. And we see this, all the housewives are pulling up. And why are they pulling up? Not because he has cultivated truth, goodness, and beauty, or because virtue identifies his existence, or he is invested in the human condition, but it's because he's got a lot of toys and a 720S bumping Fallout Boy. So notice, what is all of this doing? It creates identity as a particular kind of performance for the envy and jealousy of others. And in doing this, we reduce the other person, our neighbor. They become simply an audience rather than a equal other with whom we navigate human existence. So where's the end? 100 bands in my pocket, 100 deep when I roll. Get more bottles. The bottles are lonely. It's a moment when I show up, got them saying, wow. So again, notice, what's the goal? That they are impressed with the capitalistic winning that his identity performs, right? This is selfie culture. Look how happy I am. Look how awesome my life is. Look at me rolling through this place. Look at me on vacation. The way that selfie culture functions is that our identity is anchored in the need for the applause of others, right? Now, in this sense, the very obvious problem is that others are now either an audience for my success, right, as in the case of Post Malone, or they're obstacles to my good. They're haters. They're the people who are ruining the country. They're the people who are preventing you from succeeding. So we've got others as obstacle or audience. In either case, the other becomes objectified, right? Their subjectivity disappears in the name of the elevation of your own status. Now, this leads, I think, to some very significant problems. And so I'll give you just a few. Selfie culture necessarily presents a challenge to human flourishing, right? And this reality is one that I think anybody who's working with generally high school or college aged folks, we're kind of seeing the way this is playing out. And in particular, on the backside of COVID, and I'm not a sociologist, right? This is anecdotal in my case, though I have friends who have studied this a little bit more in depth. What we're seeing are students now in college who are almost incapacitated by the requirements of what we might just call the basic requirements of social life, right? So the idea that when we've made it all about me, and then COVID hit, and so now the problem was we had to live with ourselves because there weren't these spaces where we got to masquerade in what Heidegger would call the they. We now had to own the fact that we kind of don't like ourselves very much. And so we run back into the world and we show up and don't know how to navigate the challenges to human flourishing, because all we've ever learned is how to understand my flourishing at the cost of others. This also is the case that we become selfish as our very identity. It becomes who we are, not just things we do, right? And so this leads to what I'm calling psychological problems, because our self-love is now not appropriate in a kind of Foucaultian notion of self-care. It is instead that others are viewers, so I only ever receive myself as looked at by them. Now, this can be phenomenologically sophisticated, as in the case of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir, who will talk about the idea that I am beings before others in the sense of receiving myself as looked at. So this is why Sartre says famously, hell is other people, right? Because they're always looking at me. But in this case, it's not just that I'm receiving myself as in this relational context, and their view is one that requires me to be humbled in light of the fact that they, like me, are navigating the complicated dynamics of subjectivity. No, now they are viewers as check boxes on a brand marketing sheet, right? They are viewers in the sense of likes on a Facebook post or followers on YouTube. And footnote, at the end of this, I'm going to encourage you all to go to my YouTube channel. I realize the irony, but hopefully I'm producing some content that will at least let you get that irony as you click like. So I want to suggest that what this is a culture, selfie culture, that leads to what the philosopher, a friend of mine named Aaron James, suggests as an asshole. And an asshole, says Aaron James, is this idea that we become systematically entitled to special accommodations, and we immunize ourselves from critique from others because the others are not equals to us, right? They are, problems, right? Obstacles, or they are audience. And so I become an asshole insofar as I now narrate my own selfishness as the desired way of navigating our cultural space. Don't hate the player, hate the game, right? Don't hate me because I'm successful. You got to be an asshole in order to be, a CEO. Like we start admiring assholes rather than being critical of them. And this, I think, is what selfie culture and selfishness does to our identity. This also then underwrites our moral framework, because who we are now just becomes people who celebrate selfishness as the key to confidence. So we confuse confidence with what we might call the moral cowardice of being humble in relationship to the viewers that engage us. And so we can't see the problem because what is obvious to us drops away from our ability to engage. Heidegger says this when he talks about history being handed over as obvious. But in my opinion, the best way to understand this is David Foster Wallace, who in This Is Water says, what we take for granted is confused as just being trivial. And what we should realize is what we take for granted is the most important stuff that we let be true about us and our world. And so when we start really interrogating selfishness, maybe we can begin to see that our very story about success understood in a particular way might be an obstacle to human flourishing in the first place. And then, excuse me, this leads to a social reality, right? And so it changes who we are as an identity, our psychology. It affects how we understand the good or what's normal as our moral problem. And then it actually becomes a social problem, as I've already mentioned, because it leads to division, less connections. And then we start engaging in injustice because we think individualism and my liberty are sacrosanct possessions, right, that never can be challenged by something like responsibility. So ethics, responsibility, a concern for the other is now itself an obstacle to getting mine, right? I got to get my paper, I got to get that 720S, I've got to be someone who everybody else is saying, wow, rather than being somebody who invites others to find joy in their own lives. No, it's all about me. So what I want is all that matters. And we have a long history of how this can play out in different kinds of social and political narratives. But this is America. This is how we understand ourselves, because this becomes, again, not a critique of selfishness. This just becomes an account of what it looks like to go to college so you can get the good job, so that you can become the person with all the housewives pulling up, right? That story is maybe one we should rethink. So what would we understand as going on here philosophically? This is just what philosophers would call egoism, which is, I think, the fundamental moral view underlying this space. Now, it's important to understand that egoism, philosophical moral egoism, is not a silly view. This is actually a view that might be true. So having presented it and given you the reasons I think it's a big problem, it's important to understand that some philosophers might say, no, I'm wrong. Philosophical moral egoism is actually a view worth defending. How would we do that? Well, we start by understanding the individual self as the unit of moral concern and also the standard of moral judgment. So something is good, right? X is good if and only if X benefits me. And then what we do is say, hey, I'm not opposed to your thriving or your enjoyment of the good, but my recognition of you enjoying the good or any kind of social relationship, that's just an extension of my self-concern. So I want you to thrive because when you thrive, I'm less scared of you, right? When you are successful, I'm less worried that you're going to steal my 720S. So we end up having what we might call a classically liberal moral ontology. Whereas John Rawls says we are all free, equal, independent political beings. But then he says the all-important thing, we are mutually disinterested as political agents. What's that mean? Mutual disinterest is basically a political name for the idea that you concern yourself with your good, I'll concern myself with my good, and we'll then find a way to leave each other alone insofar as the good depends on all of us pursuing it as we understand it to work for ourselves. Now, that's not, again, a crazy view, right? So I'm trying to say, let's understand that this is something one could defend with some substance. And some people have. Friedrich Nietzsche is a philosophical moral egoist because he understands that what we will and what we say to the question, what do I want, is in fact the radical importance of the task of becoming the Übermensch, becoming someone who lives into their full potential. Now, notice, I started off by saying description and normativity are distinguished by the admissions counselor saying, we're going to teach you about the real world, and the faculty member saying, no, we're going to teach you what world could be made real and give you the agency to figure that out. Nietzsche would say, heck yes, to that faculty member, because he's trying to invite all of us to realize the world we can make real is radically individualized. What world do you want to will as true? What world do you want to say yes to? As he will talk about yes saying as a way of being philosophically sophisticated. So in order to make sense of this Nietzschean idea, we should also recognize that it doesn't have to be this sort of deep existential defense of philosophical egoism. It could be the case that we actually understand it more in an Ayn Randian way, where selfishness itself is now stripped away from this discussion of the will, and it's now just selfishness is a virtue because there are what Nietzsche would call, the masters and then the slaves. Well, his account is complicated and existentially fraught, and it takes work to really understand what's going on. Ayn Rand is not. She's saying, hey, if there are these two groups, let's go be with the strong and privileged and realize that it's up to me to figure out a way to get into that space and not be deceived by all of the envy of the other space. So Ayn Rand, Friedrich Nietzsche, these are examples of philosophical egoism. I think Nietzsche's is a more compelling version, but nonetheless, philosophical egoism is not something all philosophers reject. Now, what though if we reject their defense of egoism and say, no, this is a moral problem, not a moral option? Well, traditional moral theories seem to be a good place to go, right? To figure out how to see it as a problem. Look at the classical two big views. We see in Immanuel Kant, his deontological defense of ethics is simply a view that says, what is the good? Will it for its own sake? And treat others as ends in themselves, which means we see equality. We see that we are all, in fact, involved in this in the same sort of way. And ultimately, my relationship to you is not grounded in my own self-preference, but it's actually grounded in a commitment to the good. Well, that seems like a great way to go. Similarly, we can see this in Mill, in consequentialism. It's all about the results, but he will also make clear everyone counts as one. So when we engage in what he calls the philosophic calculus of calculating pleasure, what we're not doing is saying, my view of pleasure counts 1 billion and animals or Zachary's, those only count like 0.4, right? It doesn't work that way. Everyone counts equally. And that's why our concern for results are, Mill thinks, really concerned with a kind of moral fairness that overcomes radical selfishness, right? So the two big, competing traditional moral theories, deontology and consequentialism, seem resources for overcoming egoism. So it seems that this would be, a good idea, right? That the very thinkers who give us these foundations for modern democracy, they are worried about selfishness. However, they seem to still kind of reduce to egoism. On the one hand, think Kant, it's about freedom and autonomy being the condition of responsibility. So my freedom is the condition of any concern for being responsible in the world. I'm only concerned about the other because I don't respect the other as other. I respect the other as possessing reason like me. So notice again, it's this reduction back to myself as this kind of standard, even though it's rationally spread. Mill, same thing. Equality is self-concern. This is a way of understanding that the reason I think you count as one and they count as one is because all of us are radically self-concerned. So even though Rawls took himself to be rejecting utilitarianism in Theory of Justice, ultimately he, like Mill, are presenting this idea of we are mutually disinterested. I'm only interested in you insofar as you are part of this calculus that impacts my decision. So if this is the case, which I'm suggesting it is, we can make this better, right? It seems like they're trying, but we're not. And this is a view that I actually think the rapper Busdriver helps us understand in his track Ego Death that he did with Aesop Rock. And notice here, this is going to be a kind of meta point, compare G-Wagon, G-Wagon, G-Wagon with the following. Under the cellulite-laden thigh of the night, I slip miniature mantras between my cries and grapes. Jewel-flavored crystals in the red, blue, and white stripes, while crowds throw numbers at me like the price is right, and downtime is never met with an overjoyed grin, because sleep and death have always been conjoined twins. The sheer fact that what we see Busdriver doing is admitting of the complexity of the social context in which semantics and syntax function as meaning makers. This is just at a different level than what we see in Post Malone. And I think the problem is we have this resource. We could all do this kind of stuff. What's the problem? Go look at the Busdriver Ego Death video on YouTube. Let's just say that it is algorithmically and to a power of a bunch less successful than the Post Malone video. Right? So we're not making it better because we don't like the more complicated, rhyme-thick, lyricist performance. We want something that makes us feel really, really good about ourselves because it's hitting at the lowest common denominator, what Soren Kierkegaard will call leveling. We're not making it better, but we could. Our moral theories might be able to get us there, but dang it, they don't really seem to. We still fall back into egoism, bump the Post Malone, ignore Busdriver. So it seems that we're stuck. Traditional ethical theories might reduce back to the very thing they were meant to overcome. So how then do we go from first half of this talk, description? We live in a selfie culture. It's underwritten by a view called egoism. Egoism is something that can be philosophically defended, but we probably should see it as an issue. When we see it as an issue, these resources that we've got at our disposal don't seem to get us actually over the problem. Now, where are we? Who do we want to become? Let's now talk about who we could be if we did make it better. If we did rethink selfie culture? What if we rejected egoism? What if we saw selfie culture as a name for something that failed? And what would then happen to culture if we started seeing this success model of others as obstacles or audience as actually at odds with our moral priorities? That, I think, kind of looks like one of my favorite contemporary rappers named Rhapsody, who, notice what she does in this track called Nina, which is actually an honor to Nina Simone. She says, southern trees bearing strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. So she's starting, right, by repeating, by echoing, by locating herself in this very particular history of Billie Holiday singing this song in light of the reality of lynching and injustice that marks not only our social history, but also her identity as a woman of color, right? This is part of who she is. So she starts this rap by anchoring herself in who we've been and the possibility that we could do something differently. And then her first real line, which is, I think, one of the most fire first lines of any track, emit light or Emmett Till. Emmett Till, of course, the young black man who was killed by white hatred because he looked the wrong way at a black woman, or a white woman, excuse me, and his body was thrown into a river. It became bloated. His mom opened the casket, let these pictures be shown. So emit light rap, in other words, be a voice that changes, be something that offers what the world could be, or find yourself simply part of the very history that erased our dignity. I drew a line without showing my body. That's a skill. Bad to the bone and grill. You'd be dead wrong if looks killed. I still on my spill in the spirit of El Hill. Eye on the sparrow, nose like a pharaoh's. Our bloodline trill for the young and all the lils. We gonna get mills. She's not opposed to the idea of becoming successful, but notice the we that starts showing up, and that we anchored in her embodied subjectivity as inheriting the struggle of those who had stood for justice and invited her to find her own voice. We can make this better, and we might, is sort of what I'm taking from Rhapsody. So I want to suggest a way we might make it better, where we can emit light rap, might be looking to postmodern ethics, and in particular, Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas is a French phenomenologist, though he was born in Lithuania. So he is a Lithuanian Jewish philosopher who actually wrote in French. So when we refer to him as French, of course, there's this sort of complicated dynamic of his own cultural history. 1906, 1995, he is trained as a phenomenologist. He actually taught French to Madame Husserl, went to study under Husserl, and he says there he discovered Heidegger. His first book was the theory, or actually one of his books that like made him famous, I guess, not his first in biographical way, but he wrote a book on Husserl's theory of intuition. And this book is actually what then, so the rumor goes, is the book that Jean-Paul Sartre bought at the local bookstore to get excited about phenomenology. So there's all these kind of interrelationships that make Levinas at the center of kind of existential phenomenology in France during the middle of the 20th century. Now, he was captured in World War II. Not because he was Jewish, but because he was basically captured as a prisoner of war, because he was working for the French government in various capacities, the military. And so the only reason he didn't get sent to a death camp was because he was in a prisoner of war camp. All of his family, most of them died. His immediate family was actually smuggled out of the country. There's interesting stories about Maurice Blanchot and others, you know, like taking his papers and work and family and all this sort of stuff, helping them survive the Holocaust. And so Levinas really comes into his own in the late 40s, early 50s, because of course he had spent several years in prison, in the prisoner of war camp. And when he shows up, his famous books are Totality and Infinity and Otherwise Than Being, though he wrote quite a bit. When he shows up on the scene, his big question, his big issue that he's trying to think through is how to rethink the relationship of ontology and ethics. And so ontology, again, think description. Who is it that we are? What is the case about being? Ethics, think normativity. What is the case about what could be? What is possible in light of our action? So he rethinks the relationship of ontology to ethics in a 1951 essay called Is Ontology Fundamental? And in there, he basically challenges the idea that self-sufficiency is fundamental to human existence. And even back in 1947, he had written a book largely drafted while he was behind the walls, as it were. But he wrote a book called Time and the Other, where he has this awesome line where he says, nous pouvons pas pouvoir. We are no longer able to be able. And notice that challenge to self-sufficiency, right? We are now defined not by our ability to stand on our own 2 feet. We are defined, he thinks, by our recognition that we are fundamentally ruptured and challenged by the subjectivity and the call of the other person. And so this means that liberty and freedom are not the starting point of selfhood. They are upshots of responsibility being prior. So his basic idea is that I am grounded in responsibility. I am obligated before I am free. So I do not, as a free being, take up my responsibility. I am responsible, and my freedom names my ability to live into that responsibility consciously, or to try my best to ignore it and cover over it in some now false facade of self-sufficiency. So he calls this a theory of substitution, where the me is already implicated in you. And this means, right, that moi, the self, the me, is actually not something that is the case grounded in my inalienable human rights. It's instead the case that I am defined in my responsibility to the call that you would lay on me. Now, this is where things get really complicated, and so I'm glossing some. We can get into the weeds later. This is not something that happens in time, right? So I'm not existing and, bopping along self-sufficient and running up the flag of my own libertarian freedom, and then I run into Zachary or Animal, and they're like, nope, you got to care about us. And then damn it, I guess I've got to be responsible. Levinas's point is that the encounter with the other is something that precedes the first moment of consciousness. So it is, I think, a quasi-transcendental structure. In other words, I am always already, as he puts it, too late for that encounter. So it's not something that happens on a Tuesday at 3:30. It's something that is the occasion by which my saying, here I am, is a response after the fact. And so this is why he says that it yields an asymmetry without limit. In other words, my responsibility for the other is not something limited by my judgment about social life, right? It's, I am responsible without end, without constraint, totally, absolutely responsible. And that's the very thing that allows me to be radically singular and unique. I am responsible for the other. That uniqueness, that identity, notice how different that is from the selfie culture that says my identity is precisely this presentation that is consumed by the other. Now my identity is, in fact, having already been consumed by the other, right? I'm already theirs. And then my task is to figure out what will that look like in practical ways in light of this asymmetrical absolute relationship. So in order to, I think I have a slide that I messed up. So in order to think about selfhood as a response to what he calls the face of the other, I want to think about these three: response, face, and other in progression. And maybe this will kind of fill in some of these very complicated gaps. And in order to do this, I want to invite you to think with me about a Kendrick Lamar track where he talks about, how much $1 cost. And in this track, which interestingly, Barack Obama years ago said was his favorite track of the year. And what Kendrick does in this track is he talks about meeting this homeless person who says, hey, can you give me $1? In other words, Kendrick is confronted by the call of this other person, a sign, anything helps. Hey, man, can you spare some change? That call now requires Kendrick to respond by rolling up his window, walking faster, patting his pockets as if he had like a wad of cash that he just can't find. All things that we've probably done at one time or another in our own lives, we are responding even in trying to ignore. But what is it that we are responding to? This face of the other that calls out to us, not for $1, says Kendrick, but for recognized dignity. And so in this track, Lamar talks about the fact that it might be the case that what $1 costs us is our very soul, is eternity, is we lose heaven in light of this because we refuse to see the dignity of the person calling out, that they were not an other to us, they were irrelevant. So let's consider these in turn. What is the call and response phenomenologically? It is a structure of subjectivity. And this is differentiated from what is referred to as the question answer structure. So notice the question, right? If I say, do you like Kendrick Lamar more than Post Malone? I'm assuming that the right reply is an answer to that question that can be shared, right? So questions expect answers that then detach you from answering, because what matters is the consumability of the answer as a thing that is static on its own. The call response structure is weird phenomenologically because it's not there is the call and I see it. L'autrui is calling, right? The other is calling. Do I answer? Do I say me voici? Do I say here I am? That gets it backwards. The call is only heard when I respond. And so think about how weird this is. Think about walking down the street, you see the homeless person, asking for help. If we read this as a question, anything helps, and our response is, I've got nothing to give you, and walk off, notice I received what was being presented as a question, and I answered the question. It may not be the way that the person wanted, but that's the end of a transactional engagement. Call response is, I now become utterly aware of the discomfort that is now laid upon me. And so I'm trying my best to throw it into a question answer. Oh, sorry, I don't have any money. Rather than recognizing what I'm really doing is responding to your request for dignity by saying, not today. And that call only gets heard as a call when I find myself responding to it in that way, trying to cover over it, trying to find a way out from under the responsibility that it lays upon me. So the call response is a structure of selfhood, a structure of subjectivity that is inviting us to make sense of ourselves as humbled by and challenged in our self-sufficiency. This is developed by a philosopher named Jean-Louis Chrétien in his book called The Call and Response. Just in case anybody really is excited about this particular idea, go check it out. So what calls? The face of the other, says Levinas. What is the face, or le visage? It is not the actual fleshy stuff, or the, as he says, the nape of our neck, or the cut of our jib, or the way that our nose crinkles. Those are simply concrete manifestations of the depth dimension the face conveys. So he says at one point that even a shoulder can be a face, right? What he's trying to say is the face of the other is not literally this stuff. The face of the other is what calls me. It is the fact that the other is an other as such and counts as such and cannot be subsumed into my narrative of self-identity and self-concern. They are not another like me. They are the other. And that depth dimension of their moral dignity that calls to me in a way that my very response is either becoming freely invested in or freely trying to cover over that fundamental interaction. What calls the face and who calls the other? And this is an interesting move because think about it. If there's just one other, right, in this kind of quasi-transcendental sense, I'm infinitely obligated. Well, it turns out this would be good news because now I can do everything for the other who calls me. The problem is, let's say Animal calls and says, hey, can you be on this talk tonight? Give a thing about Levinas. And I say, great, absolutely. And then my wife calls and says, hey, can you go pick up our son at band practice? I can't do both. Right? So which other really calls such that my response is now adjudicated in one way rather than the other? This is what Levinas calls the third, or le tiers, right? It's the third party. It's where we move from ethics to politics, he says. Ethics, actually pretty easy. You are infinitely obligated to the other. Politics, really, really, really difficult because you are infinitely obligated to each other. But there's more than one of them, which means now you've got to adjudicate and calculate and create institutions of social relationships that allow us to do the best we can in ways that are sustainable. I can't feed all of the homeless people, but maybe we can create institutions that work to overcome charity, and all of us can now go pick up our kids at band camp and give talks about Levinas while also contributing to the institution that is able then to be concerned about these others that are still my other. Now, this is, I think one of the trickiest parts in Levinas's corpus is the move from ethics to politics. I have written a lot about this. So I'm not going to go into the weeds, but I'm happy to come back and try to give you some suggestions about how I think this plays out. For our purposes, it's just to help you understand his moral vision is one that does not just take us into a kind of mystical space where the other calls woo at us. It actually throws us back into the real complicated questions of immigration policy and healthcare policy and the way that we understand reproductive rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that. The very defense of democracy itself, says Levinas, is a moral task. So here's the thesis of a Levinasian view. This is from one of my favorite bands, Flowbots. The idea is we rise together. Like, we've got to understand we're in this together. Listen to some of their claims. So much pain, we don't know how to be but angry. Feel infected like we've got gangrene, but please don't let anybody try to change me. Me, just me, in the middle of a sea full of faces, some laugh, some salivate. What's in your alleyway, recycling bins, or bullet cases? Notice, that's the selfie culture. They're saying, this is where we find ourselves. It's just me. It's just about how I do. And then they say, but it's not equal, right? You can't just be you because you're implicated in that history that Rhapsody talks about. It's not fair. We're different people, but we're not scared. We ain't never scared to pave a new path. Description to normativity, make a new street and build a new bridge. Say, can you see by the dawn's early light? And now they're again appealing to that shared history by which our moral commitments in political spaces play out. They're always historically located. Free slaves running, songs words weren't right. Now a new day's coming, the few stay stunning while the many are handsome. Your soul is alive, but they want it for ransom. This, by the way, those lines, I know Animal likes Husserl and Heidegger, like that's freaking Husserl and Heidegger, their theory of the crisis and the theory of the they self. The few stay stunning, but the many are handsome, right? We want what they are selling. And it costs us our soul, right? The bass drumming's the anthem. We step to the heartbeats of our granddaughters and grandsons, and together we rise. So notice what the Flowbots are offering us is precisely the view that Levinas is inviting us to think through, and Levinas is giving us the phenomenological account of selfhood that makes this moral vision possible. There are some obstacles, however, to take to the streets and rise together. And here, I'm a mountain biker, and so I tried to find some pictures. Some of these are actually obstacles. This is one in West Virginia that I faced a week ago. This is about a 5-foot drop off of that rock to the ground. And then when you hit the ground, you have to hit this wall ride, which puts you up basically perpendicular to the wall so that you can stay anchored onto it and have traction to then jump off the other side, which is called a gap, and you gap off the other side and catch the trail moving down. I did not ride this particular obstacle because it was the first day I was there and I wanted to ride for 4 days and didn't want to go to the hospital. We ended up doing that the next day when my buddy decided to go over the bars face first. And so we ended up at the hospital for a while and then went back to the trails. But there are real obstacles in life, right? Risk demands that we be aware of our vulnerability. So I want to suggest that these are some obstacles to being good Levinasians. Man, this looks too demanding to apply to individual actions. Infinite responsibility? Come on. Maybe Richard Rority's right when he just says, look, the goal of ethics is to do the best we can for as many as we can and make tomorrow better than today. And so you go to sleep feeling like you did the best you could, wake up tomorrow, do some more. Levinas, in contrast, says, we are plagued by insomnia. We can never sleep easy because whenever we go to bed, we failed to give pillows to all of those sleeping on the ground tonight, right? There's never a place that we can rest easy that we've done enough, ever. It's always the obstacle, always something more, always too great for us. That's a real problem, right? Because what I think this does is it invites us to a kind of resignation. I'll never be able to pull it off, so why try? And that is a real issue. Why not go get mine? Hell, I'll take a 720S. I can't make the world better. I can't stop poverty. So at least I can ride around in an S-Class. Like, that temptation, I actually think, is in play in Levinas's account because it's just so demanding. But second, it really seems too abstract to apply. And notice this dude jumping off this root ball. In order to do this, you've got to understand a specific anti-row motion where you are throwing the front of the bike forward to unweight the front wheel so that you can let the back wheel come off the obstacle before the nose dives. It's only the case that you can ride gnarly stuff because you know the difference of body motion in a jump versus a drop. It has to be non-abstract. It has to be very concrete and applicable. Not, hey, there's something coming up. I don't know, do something. And Levinas, unfortunately, never, ever, ever gives us specific instruction on what to do and how to do it, ever. And he says, surely you can do this with what I've given you, but that's not my goal, right? He's trying to give us what I would describe as a phenomenological account of responsibility as ontologically constitutive. Ethics goes all the way down. But how do we put this in practice? Like, imagine this Levinasian account at a school board meeting or on the floor of the Senate. Like, I don't know. Like, part of me thinks, no, what you want is somebody who knows, no, that's a drop, push a front wheel. This is how we do it. This law, this policy, and Levinas seems not to give us that, which instead of leading to a kind of resignation seems to lead to a kind of quietism. I don't know what really to suggest. And so maybe I just shouldn't talk, right? And then it also seems to be just too difficult to understand. Like, what he's actually saying is so complicated that it's impossible to translate into practical guidance. And here, this is a really gnarly little stretch of roots and rocks. Notice the only way you can navigate this is because you actually see a line through it before you drop in. The problem with Levinas is we never see a line through it because we are always infinitely obligated at every moment. So there's no way to kind of get your bearings on that stable ground before you drop into the obstacle. And this, it seems to me, leads to a kind of nihilism, right? What's the point? So resignation, quietism, and nihilism are three real challenges to Levinasian moral thought. Let me give you an example of how that looks. This is Levinas. Let me read some of this to you, just because, yeah. Ethics as substitution for the other, as donation without reserve, breaks up the unity of transcendental apperception, which is the condition of all being and experience. As disinterestedness, in the radical sense of the term, ethics signifies the improbable field wherein the infinite is in relation, where, on the contrary, it comes to pass only as infinity and as awakening. The infinite transcends itself in the finite. It passes the finite in that it orders the neighbor to me without exposing itself to me. This is an order that slips into me like a thief. Despite the taut weave of consciousness, a trauma that surprises me absolutely, always already past in a past that was never present and remains irrepresentable. Like, when I read stuff like this, like, what in the hell, right? So I've spent my life reading Levinas, and I still encounter passages like this, and I'm like, oh, good grief. How in the world am I going to try to present this to my city council about why we should rethink our refugee policy? So this is a real issue. But in light of these obstacles, can Levinas really, though, provide help for overcoming the selfishness of selfie culture in the name of social, ethical, political, cultural flourishing? I think he can. Here's how I think he can do it. First, ethics is a matter of selfhood, not selfishness. In other words, what he does is invites us to change the frame by which we make sense of the questions. Who are we? Not simply, what should I do? You hear a lot these days, especially in America, about, the soul of the country, and this is not who we are, and all this kind of stuff. These are compelling rhetorical moves. But if you stop and say, no, who really are we? Are we the society that made Billie Holiday's song continue to be quoted today in light of the reality of a Black Lives Matter movement because systemic racism continues to be prominent? Like, is that who we are? And I want to suggest, yes, it's who we are, and that effing sucks. So how can we then recognize who we are is actually an historical call to be and do differently, right? Notice how different that is, though, as a framework, as the kind of way we start engaging, than if we start with success as this kind of selfie culture, whereby the whole point is to simply get more likes, be a better brand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not asking, but who are we? We're asking, oh, am I influencing enough, right? And this is why I want to say appropriate self-love is important. Levinas does not talk much about this. He should. And here I think Kierkegaard is just better. Those of you who want to read Works of Love by Kierkegaard, I think this is actually a kind of great couplet with Levinas, because only if you can love your neighbor as yourself and recognize that doesn't mean I'm grounding it back in self-love, but I'm actually loving myself insofar as I love my neighbor, all right? That radically shifts the register at which self-love gets deployed as an investment in my neighbor. How much a dollar cost, right? It costs more than we think. Also, what about politics? Here, politics, I want to suggest we need to stop thinking of it as justice for all, because notice what all does. It now groups, it universalizes, it objectifies, it clumps. Justice for all is a language game that appeals to the herd, the they, the public, the crowd, all of these things that existentialists and phenomenologists have challenged. But what if it was justice for each? Now the thing is, it's not justice for all, best we can. Sorry, dude, if you're homeless, like things didn't work out for you, but all of us are pretty good, right? Now it's no, 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 no. We have failed so long as that guy continues to sleep outside tonight. We have failed so long as any injustice occurs because of somebody's skin color or historically marginalized status. Now you don't have to talk about systemic injustice and get into the debates about woke culture. We're all agreed it's messed up so long as anyone experiences X, Y, and Z. Not some grouping, but now we can think about groupings as basically correlates for multiple others continuing to experience injustice. So this then shifts our discourse. Yeah, we can still talk about rights. They have a valuable place in our society. But what if we talked about rights in light of responsibilities, rather than talking about rights as these sacrosanct things and F you and the horse you rode in on if you're going to make me wear a mask and keep me from going to church? What if we instead said, look, what if churches were understood as the maximal site of neighbor love? You probably wouldn't then be whining about the fact that you can't meet because literally millions of people are dying. Now what you would realize is, hey, there's more to this church. This is my philosophy of religion self showing up just for a minute. Now we might start rethinking how we understand even God or faith or relationships internal to the religious structures of our society as deepening and taking up justice, responsibility, and concern, rather than just sites of defending rights. And so then democracy, rather than being overcome or rejected, Levinas defends democracy. Because notice, the equality of moral standing is now what grounds the equality of the voice of all, of each, of every single other. As Derrida puts it, to oat, every other is absolutely other, which means, and this is hard, right? I'm a progressive politically. dang it, that conservative who I think is wrong about society, her voice is necessarily equal in moral standing. Doesn't mean that her view is equally reasonable or rational or well supported with evidential argument, right? But notice, I can't dismiss her as irrational or immoral out of the gate. I've got to actually engage. And that then becomes the regrettable decision as a result of failed engagement. But not many of us want to do this because it's hard work. It's exhausting work. And what we do is narrate self-care as the ability just to be surrounded by people who keep saying yes to us and affirming us, which is important in lots of historical contexts. Don't get me wrong. But it's also the case that finding ways as social beings to say the equality of moral standing is something that forces us to invest ourselves in relationships to those with whom we disagree. That's hard. And this is then going to lead, I think, to revisions in policy. So we switch our discourse. Not what about me, but what about her? What about him? Now, when I was putting this together, this was before the Trump second indictment. So there's a lot of whataboutism. It's like, well, what about Hillary Clinton? That's not what I'm talking about when I say what about her. My what about her is, instead of thinking what benefits me, I can say, yeah. Like I'm probably okay, but have we remembered that she's not, that he's not, that they're struggling tonight? Like if we start thinking that way, our okayness is now an outgrowth of our investment in the other, rather than a defense of my rights, my status, my freedom, and the others are obstacles to it. So I think this is practical, right? So social and cultural life then is investment, not entitlement. And this is important because it resituates all of our personal interests, not as irrelevant, but as in the context of a shared human condition. And what I describe as the human condition, this is a new book I just finished, is our vulnerability and our relationality are crucial to our finite embodiment. Who we are is able to be broken with others, right? And if that's where we start, man, that makes a difference. And now we can do the hard work of saying, in our board meetings and our school council meetings and our Senate meetings and our local listening sessions, now how can we then take seriously that shared human condition? And our disagreements might continue, but they don't have to be overriding, right? So here are my conclusions. I think we replace selfishness with neighbor love. Again, that sounds trivial. The specifics would be we move from egoism to otherism, which is this Levinasian vision I've tried to lay out. We replace selfie culture with what I'm describing as a culture of relational selfhood. And the language that I work out in my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, is we move from success language to faithfulness language, from achievement and external visibility to becoming and constant betterment, right? So maybe we should start taking selfies with Levinas. And I actually took this earlier today. This was entirely for Animal because I wanted to see my drum set. So there you go. It's a Yamaha Stage Custom, all birch with a maple custom snare and Zildjian A cymbals. So as a way of closing, here's what I want to leave you with. This is a traditional Irish song called The Parting Glass. I wish I could play it for you because, boy, it's beautiful. But it simply says, of all the money that e'er I've spent it in good company. And all the harm that e'er I did, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass, good night and joy be with you all. Notice here, it's not ignoring the personal stakes, the personal location, the personal decisions, and the personal responsibility, but it's nesting those in our inherently social, relational, and vulnerable existence. So before I open it up, connect with me. And I realize this is kind of bullshitty in light of everything I've said. But hop on my website. I would love for you to sign up to my newsletter. It's where I send out monthly newsletters with exclusive philosophical content and long form videos about different ideas. And then also go to my YouTube channel, Philosophy for We Find Ourselves, where I do weekly videos trying to make philosophy accessible to everywhere we find ourselves, and especially in relationship to outdoor activities like mountain biking and trout fishing and camping and things like that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't wait to be refuted by you smart people. I will now open it up to our moderators.
First off, thank you. That was amazing. Oh goodness. Before I jump in with my questions and comments, let me open that up to the floor for others.
Looking at the chat and the Q&A here. So if anybody has questions or anything, drop them in there. We'll take a look.
If not, so today at Bethesda Project, where we're doing our hands-on heuristics, doing some poetry through philosophy, our theme today was anger, wrath, and understanding. And picked a few poems that fit that, and then had some selections from Aristotle about appropriate anger versus excessive anger, or maybe deficiencies. I myself had to battle with my anger demons this week and make sure that I don't pop off at the wrong person or let anger from this situation seep into an inappropriate situation, and to keep clear judgment. And so I wonder if this practical approach to the infinite obligation to the other can serve as a way of moderating excess in anger or in just a high inflated sense of self.
Yeah, it's a good question. So Levinas doesn't really talk a lot about anger, but it's interesting. I mean, what the guy lived through is, except in rare circumstances, hard for us really to understand, right? I mean, going through the Holocaust, losing family members, he dedicates Otherwise Than Being, to victims of anti-Semitism, and then actually lists some of the names of family members in Hebrew. I mean, it's staggering, sort of the context in which, as he puts it, the hatred of the other man constitutes an anti-Semitism that plagues all people, right? Every person is victimized by the hatred of the other man. And it certainly is the case where anger would seem warranted, right? So it's important not to think that emotions like anger are necessarily problematic or always a moral failure or reflect some sort of lack of virtue. Maya Angelou, in fact, once was asked, how she was able to navigate, again, this unbelievably traumatizing life and history and story and not get angry. And her response, because if you watch her, I often say, like, always a good idea, watch interviews with Maya Angelou and read anything by Anne Lamott. Like, that's always a good idea. Wherever you find yourself, those are my suggestions. But when you watch Maya Angelou, like, she never seems angry, right? It's always bubbly, and she's passionate and engaging and brilliant and poetic, but she never seems angry. And her response to the person who says, "How are you not angry?" And she says, "Oh, I'm angry. Like, if I'm not angry, I'm not paying attention." Right. She's like, the people, and it's interesting, like the people we now just name as like these icons of civil rights, like Malcolm X or James Baldwin, whatever. She's like, these were friends of mine. Right. So, the idea that, when she heard about, I forget if it was the death of King or X, but it was because James Baldwin came to her house and told her. Like, this is a different space where these are not just names of people, just historical artifacts. These are friends that she has ate with and argued with. And she's like, I'm angry. But she says, when anger takes over, it then prohibits me from creating a space where anger now doesn't continue unabated, right? And so she encourages us not to never get angry, but to realize that anger is rarely going to be productive for some sort of healing or overcoming what occasioned the anger in the first place. And an example of this is she had a party once, and somebody came in and had told some off-color joke. I forget if it, racist or sexist or something that was kind of off-color. She stops the party. It was at her home, like stops the party and tells the person, look, we'll figure this out tomorrow, but now you've got to leave my house because I can't let that hatred, that sentiment, as she puts it, become part of my drapes. Right? She says it, like smoke, gets trapped and it then infects the very place. And unless I expel you now, this place will become toxic from what you've allowed to become part of the space, right? And I always thought that was cool because she like cussed the person out and like, so we're done with her. She says, no, like she's angry, right? How dare you say that in my house? But even at that moment, it was an occasion to say, because I recognize you also as a person of moral dignity, we're actually going to help each other navigate this, right? And so it's not about not being angry, but I think Levinas sort of invites us into that same sort of space. And he as a practical example of this, he once gets asked, so does the SS officer have a face? There's a good question, right? Because, does the abuser have a face? Does the racist have a face? Like, these are questions that often we want to say, no, punch a Nazi, right? Which again is not irrational. So I don't think that's an irrational response. Just war theory might actually support it. But what Levinas does is not simply jump there. He says something really sophisticated. He says, I'm not the person to ask. Isn't that slick? So what he's doing is saying, given my history, the SS officer is not going to be the person I'm easily able to engage as face. But that doesn't mean they then are not faces, right? It just may be too complicated for him given his history. I say this sometimes, I still identify in Christian communities, for example, and I'm LGBTQ affirming. And so I've got lots of friends who say, how dare you still be part of those spaces? And I'm like, well, I get it, but here's the thing, the difficulty of navigating a space that may not be fully affirming and welcoming, that's not where you need to spend time, because like love yourself enough not to be there and navigate. But I want that place to change. And so maybe because I'm not threatened by this particular kind of hostility, I can maybe be a wedge that allows that to be seen as hatred and problems and injustice. But I can do it because I can engage their faces without actually navigating individual embodied harm, right? And I might not be able to do that in other contexts where they can function, right? So Levinas recognizes that we're not all called at all minutes to be saying everything to everyone. We do, this is where I think he actually is Rortian, we do the best we can with what we've got where we are. But we never get tempted by the idea that we've done enough, right? And that is where I think, we do the best we can to not be overrun by anger, because it'll probably eat us alive, as Angelou understood. But it's also probably something that we recognize, if we're not angry, we're not paying attention. I don't know if that helps. Does that give at least some framing for it?
Oh, yes. Wonderful, wonderful. More thoughts on that or another question? I have questions and questions, and I don't want to dominate, so.
I'm seeing nothing in the Q&A or chat. So anybody who's hanging out with us, drop them in. If not, I will just keep talking to these fine folks, and we'll go with that. It's all good with me.
Well, I do have a Husserl question.
Yeah.
No,
we can all. That's always a thing worth asking.
Now, I want to preface this with that I am very persuaded by this this notion of responsibility preceding freedom, and that we shouldn't be tempted to think that we are finished our responsibility to the other and that this call disappears. I wonder about Husserl's notion of intersubjectivity. That being said, now I can see maybe Levinas's critique here with the concept of the monad and how the monad is transcendentally, the other is built in to our consciousness. However, it is we recognize that monad as similar to me. And if we experience something that seems like a monad but comes from an alien world, that is an alien world, and we only get to know it based on it assimilating into our world of understanding. And he even writes in Formal and Transcendental Logic that the way that we build, associations are based on harmony, so that if somebody of a different political background or culture, we might not recognize them as equal in that manner. I wonder if Husserl is being descriptive in showing how humans really are thinking, and that Levinas might be presenting a sort of ideal ought, in this sense, one that I find very compelling, but that might not be natural to everyone, or people who were raised right. No, I'm just
Yeah, that's interesting. So Levinas's critique of Husserl on this front tends to be located more in his reading of Cartesian Meditations. And it's due to the fact that there, Husserl tends to think about the relation to the other as his language of an alter ego, right? And so the consciousness of other, and we even see some of this in Heidegger, Being and Time, at least, where my consciousness of other Dasein is recognizing that they are being in a world, right? Like I'm extrapolating from my experience and recognizing that they are either, right, really complicated robots, which is a question that Heidegger raises, or they are worlding beings. And I think that Husserl in Cartesian Meditations, in his language of alter ego, effectively is presenting something very similar, where what I see is this object is different in its being subject, right? And notice, though, in both of those cases, in Heidegger and Husserl, the status of being subject is oddly, how to put it, it's oddly active, right? So it's, I am being in a world, which sounds really passive, but of course, what it means to be in a world, and for anybody watching this on YouTube, when I do this, I'm hyphenating. That's my hyphen move, being hyphen in hyphen world. Like when we are being in a world, what that means is I take myself up as constituted by what Heidegger will call Sorge, right? That I am concerned about the world in particular ways. I'm concerned about my car by getting it oil changed. I'm concerned about, my bike by, bleeding its brakes. I'm concerned about my son, though, in a little bit different way. And the different way is I recognize I've got to free him up to his own agency relative to concern. And this is what he calls leaping ahead of, as opposed to leaping in, the difference in Einspringen and Vorausspringen. And so I'm answering via Husserl, Heidegger, but I'll get back to Husserl. So the idea is when we talk about this subject as a distinctive kind of object in a world, right? The alter ego for Husserl as different than the cup on the table or the tree out the window. The difference that we're locating phenomenologically is that as given to my intentional consciousness, these objects are given as similarly tasked with some mode of active shaping, right? They are world creators at some level. And this makes tons of sense. And I actually think this is descriptively true. I think they're right about this. The tricky part, says Levinas, is if this is the way we understand things to be, right? Well, it can happen at two levels. It could be, this is just descriptively the way things work as a kind of like developmental psychology account. And maybe that's right. But it's also the case that we've got to ask the question, am I duped by my moral judgments? And this is the first question of totality infinity. And Levinas thinks that if Heidegger and Husserl are the final word on my account of the other, their subjectivity is simply this kind of agential or active world creation sort of thing, which again is perfectly in line with a broadly existentialist trajectory, right? I am my decisions. Levinas doesn't reject that as practically often the case, but if that goes all the way down, if ontology is fundamental, as Heidegger is trying to say, being in a world just is what I am. And for Husserl, this account of transcendental ego just is what I am. This is why we can then articulate what he offers in the Logic and also in Ideas 1. Well, then it seems like my encounter with subjects is really just a judgment about their being like me in this particular capacity. The problem with this, as Levinas, is then our moral judgments are fundamentally misguided. We are not in the end responsible. We simply have the option of taking up responsibility, right? And that is the crux for Levinas. So do I think that both can be right? Yeah, I absolutely do. But I think it's going to happen at different levels, right? So I think especially in Ideas 2, we see subjectivity is intersubjectivity for Husserl. So when you get kind of in his later thought and really in the weeds, like, shoot, he's kind of moving, I think, Levinasianly. And we see something similar in like Letter on Humanism from Heidegger. And again, his later stuff, even some of what we find in the Beiträge, Heidegger's really weird late stuff, you start seeing some of these kind of awarenesses that maybe there's more to subjectivity than just this kind of subjective capacity to be agential. And this is where Levinas would step in and say, right. And he actually, again, here's a hyphen coming. He actually says, to be subject is to be sub-jectum, to be placed under, right? Placed under the weight of reality. Well, what is the weight of reality? It is to take myself up as world creator only insofar as I recognize the world I am called to create is a world defined by the face of the other each and every single time. And my freedom is the name I give to whether or not I then strive to live into that. So I do think if we want to talk about just, how things function, Levinas is probably not the best place to go. If we want to talk about the way things function in light of what we also, though, think has to be true, right? Levinas gives us that kind of extra layer. And that's why I don't think that he's necessarily at odds with Heidegger, except at the, where does this ultimately land? Does it ultimately land at the ontology of Dasein, or does it ultimately land at the face of the other? That's fundamentally incompatible. But it's the ultimacy question, not it lands at the face of the other. And so now we've actually got this really cool account of how the other presents as a kind of being in a world in context of meaning. And then I think Heidegger can actually just fill in as a sort of, so what does this then look like most of the time? I think Heidegger gets that right. And Husserl, again, kind of giving them both the language for the work that they're doing.
And it's, I mean, there's work at the archives happening now to explicate Husserl's ethics, but it's just an amalgam of Kant and Aristotle as some sort of mix of virtue and try your best. So it isn't as if Husserl gives us much in the way of robustly accounting for the weight of that responsibility and that feeling of it. It's all very judgmenty, disinterested in a very scientific way.
And Levinas doesn't give us, again, like I think we should be honest. When I say there are these real obstacles to appropriating Levinas, it's because I'm some days wrecked by them. Like it might really be the case that we should just say, because I'm Levinasian, I'm done with Levinas, I'm going to go be a pragmatist. Like that's actually, I think, a plausible way to be Levinasian in the world is to say, this just isn't helpful. What's helpful is How can I make poverty less prominent? How can I make child welfare more prominent? How can I make healthcare more accessible? And just say, you know what? I'm going to have to work with people I disagree. I'm going to have to get the best deal I can. Like, I'm not suggesting that that's the right way. It's just that's a reasonable way, I think, of being Levinasian in the world. And so I admit I'm definitely not what we might call, in metal music or hip hop, whatever, we talk about like the gatekeepers, it's like, oh, but how many Slayer songs do you really know if you're going to wear that t-shirt? Don't be a poser. I think that there's a real danger to, giving into a kind of like Levinasian gatekeeping praxis where it's like, and this is broader, like postmodern ethics in general, right? You're not a real feminist unless, you're not a real Levinasian unless. And I think a lot of that is, well-intentioned, but I think that the real point of it, of all this work, queer theory, critical race theory, feminism, Levinasian, whatever it is, all of it's trying to say, man, like things are kind of effed up. But the fact that they are effed up means that the call of the other has to have traction. Because if it doesn't have traction, they're not really effed up. They're just not the way we wish they were. And then we're duped, right? Because then it's back to preference, back to my way. And this is what Richard Rorty says. He's like, yeah, I want us to be less cruel. Let's eliminate suffering so far as possible. Not because it's good, not because it's what responsibility demands, but because, that's the world I like. I'm a liberal. And he owns that. I think that's really honest. I also think it's really dangerous because then the difference between the civil rights vision and the segregationist vision is purely a difference of power. And that then reduces to what Simone Weil calls force. Who can force the other enough to get on board with their account? And I think Levinas's fundamental account is no force, like they suggest. That's the thing that's morally problematic. Right? But the only way that's morally problematic is because there's something deeper than the functioning of power. Critique doesn't go all the way down. Eventually, critique runs up against that in the name of which critique is offered. Derrida calls this justice, but then he gets really touchy, right? But what then does justice look like? He's like, as soon as we start naming it, now we're doing the work of political engagement. We have to. But don't ever think that then one political vision just wins, right? And this is why I often use, again, I am on the left politically, and yet I find Levinas and Derrida and others to be the most vocal critics of the complacency of my own political self-righteousness, right? And that sucks. I'll be like, that sucks some days because I don't want to take seriously at all X, Y, or Z. And of course, X, Y, or Z are not views. They're also kind of people, right? And I don't want to take those people seriously. Those people are problems. They're obstacles. But then notice I'm immediately throwing myself back into the selfie culture narrative of others, right? So how can I see that view as an obstacle? And so long as that person defends that view, they are positioning themselves alongside something I think that is destructive for our society and for justice. So I'm going to fight against that. But there's always, says Levinas, room for charity on the other side of justice, right? How does their face never disappear? And man, that's hard work. And that's where I think when I say Levinas is so important for our contemporary political life, what I don't mean is, hey, everybody, go buy Totality and Infinity. That's a bad idea. What I do think is a good idea is all of us to start saying, but what if I let myself ask the question, maybe it's not about me. What about them? What about her? Like if we started that kind of moral whataboutism, maybe it would be just enough of an interruption to maybe let us like have an opening to thinking more effectively together. And I don't know, it may not work, but I think, again, this is the kind of thing that, you actualize your freedom in trying your best to see if you can make it work so far as possible. And the example I give my students a lot is imagine I hate running long distances. I'm always going to be on a bike. I do not like running. But I have friends, who run marathons and stuff, right? And I think that's just absolutely unbelievably impressive and also kind of nuts. And so imagine, though, it's not just, well, you're going to run 26.2 miles in 4 hours. Well, that's humanly possible. It's not for me, right? Zachary might be able to do it, but it's not for me. But now I need you to run 26.2 miles in 30 minutes. Well, now that's not humanly possible, right? So like there's a point where we're going to hit a spot where now that is an impossible task. The question is, if ethics is an impossible task, which is what Levinas and Derrida and so many others kind of presented as being, it's not about algorithmic adjudication, checking the boxes, getting the followers, winning the day. It's about constantly being faithful to this call of the other. The question then becomes, all right, so freedom is, are you going to be the person who sits down at the starting line and says, this is an effed up race? I can't win this race, right? So if I can't win, if I can't get them saying, wow, if I can't get my 720S bumping, like if that's not possible, I'm out. Or will you be the person who says, all right, so my goal can't be to win anymore. My goal is to run as effing hard as I possibly can for as long as my legs will let me do it. And think about it. That's what we kind of celebrate in all of our great stories and poems and, human framings of virtue. This is why Mother Teresa says it's about faithfulness, not success. This is why Martin Luther King talks about faith being taking steps that you can't see. In other words, you can't see the finish line, run, right? This is why when we frame ourselves as success-oriented entities in a selfie culture, we might be having all the people rolling up with, 100 band, but it also is probably the case that we are never going to find ourselves truly ruptured by the call of the other person. And the language I give this, if I'm speaking more religiously, this is what I describe as a kenotic logic. So instead of it being a logic of status and sufficiency, it's a logic of radical self-emptying and self-denial and humility. And so again, back to Kendrick Lamar, sit down, be humble, right? Like it turns out that's maybe the best moral advice we can get,
So we shouldn't imagine Sisyphus happy. We should imagine him faithful to the call of the other.
That's right. And it's interesting in my book, Camping with Kierkegaard, which should be out in a few months for anybody watching this, again, hop on my newsletter on my website so I can let you know. I'm going to put together a launch team. And so I'll send the book to them early and we'll do a live stream event where we can all talk about it and stuff. So I hope they'll hop in on this. But in that book, I talk about Sisyphus because it's all about mountain activities. And so, of course, Sisyphus is going to be important because he's a mountain climber, right? And the tricky thing about Sisyphus is, he pushes the rock and he never finishes pushing the rock. Camus says, but the rock is his thing. So why do we imagine Sisyphus happy? Because he has purpose. He has reason. He gets out of bed because there's something worth doing. In other words, he's not duped by the task of meaning making. That's where I think this is Levinas. The way I narrate that is exactly what you said. Sisyphus is somebody faithful to being the sort of person who pushes the rock because the rock is his thing, not being somebody who is successful at having pushed the rock. All that is a recipe for a midlife crisis. Right? You go get your first million, you be CEO, you get full professor, whatever the thing, you get your 720S, like whatever it is. And then you wake up the next day and you're like, man, I'm just as anxious. I'm just as depressed. Like, shoot, now I need something else. And so it's always that kind of addictive sense of more. And, no wonder we have an increasing wealth disparity from the haves and the have-nots because we've trained everybody to think more is always better. But sometimes more is not always better. Sometimes it's just more, right? And that is, I think, can I imagine Sisyphus happy? Insofar as I think faithfulness is a way of life, yeah, because I think he's faithful.
Yeah. Now, Andreas mentioned deontology in the chat, and I was about to bring up Kant. I want to offer Andreas an opportunity to speak a little bit more on that if they would like.
Yeah. Hop in, Andreas. Let me hear what are your thoughts about on deontology? I think I know where you're going, but I'd love to hear it.
Oh, have you got no
No
mic?
mic.
Ah,
So let me see, Andreas, if what I'm assuming is right, and you can tell me no. It sounds like deontology or Kantian ethics is fundamentally about algorithmic instruction that takes away the complexity of faithfulness, because the ultimate goal is simply to literally do what reason demands. But as Kant makes clear, we can only do what reason demands insofar as it is doable, right? So Kant is clear that there is never the case that we are required to do what is not doable. This is the ought implies can principle in moral philosophy. So if that's right, if Kant's right, then Levinas is wrong to say that we are infinitely obligated, that we can never do enough, that we are insomniacs because of our moral responsibility. Faithfulness is actually just a recipe for being miserable. Kant actually is better to say, no, we can run this rational calculus, produce a moral responsibility that is doable and universalizable regardless of who we are. So now there's no individual struggle to figure out my responsibility. There's simply responsibility given these circumstances. So it sounds like that what I'm suggesting is that that account, that deontological account, is actively immoral. And what I'm taking you to be saying is, but wait a minute, are you really suggesting that Kantian ethics is now immoral? Right? So does that sound plausible, Andreas, as a kind of framing of the concern you have? For those of you watching on YouTube later, we are waiting with bated breath to see Andreas's reply, which is forthcoming, hopefully. Yes. Kant resorts to the idea of an ideal good, which is, and again, the key thing is it's ideal insofar it is doable, right? And for Levinas, the tricky part is the call of the other fundamentally implicates me in the lack of doability, right? It's not doable full stop. It is doable only insofar as I recognize that it's constitutively undone. This is why Levinas describes, this actually gives rise to some in Derrida about justice being undeconstructible, and yet justice always calls for us to recognize that we are not just enough. Levinas describes this as a relationship between three notions called the saying, the said, and the unsaid, which is weird. What he means is the ethical call is not an algorithmic thing that I can articulate in some sort of moral frame, right? And so the said would be this moral account. It's the policy, it's the Kantian algorithm, it's the categorical imperative, it's something that is the case. It's the account I give of the right thing in a specific circumstance. The saying is the approach of the other that constantly calls me to this infinity of moral obligation. And what Levinas tries to say is that the saying, the approach of the other, can never be reduced to a said. Because as soon as I give that account, this is part of why his books are so hard, is because the book is an account of the approach. But it only works insofar as that account underwrites and undermines the totality of the approach itself. But then he says, we've got to say something, but then we've got to unsay what we've said, lest it become a kind of complacency. So that unsaying, that justice to come, as Derrida will talk about, or the democracy to come, is the name we give to the ideal, but it's an ideal that is not actualizable. It's an ideal that always challenges whatever we actualize as never just enough, right? And so, as Andreas continues, does Levinas have a foundation pour la morale like that which Francois Jullien unveils in Mencius, similar to Shakespeare's Common Sense? Yeah, so yes and no. It depends what we mean by the foundation, right? Or the bedrock. if we mean by foundation, does Levinas give us what I'm calling a quasi-transcendental structure that is the kind of condition of phenomenologically justifying this moral sense that we find ourselves having in life? Yeah, that is this ontology of constitutive responsibility. That is the face of the other. Is he giving us a foundation in the sense of like what we would find in Plantinga, like a properly basic belief, something that now just serves without challenge, that is the unconditioned? Well, not really, because remember, we have to unsay any account we would give even of the face of the other. So whenever I think I've got the other figured out, the other wrecks my ability to think that I'm done. So it's never going to be a foundation such that, that's the starting point, that's the bedrock. It's going to be a bedrock for which I am always too late, right? It's going to be a foundation that is always shaking, because the only way I could account for the foundation is to try to stand on it as if I had it figured out. But the it is not a thing, it's the face of the other that ruptures phenomenality. And here again, anybody watching later will notice any pushing on this, and it gets very phenomenologically technical. And so I was trying in the presentation not to do it, but this is where it has to go if we as philosophers are going to kind of really think about it. Levinas is a new phenomenologist. So this means he's interested in what I would describe as the phenomenology of excess. And that excess is always going to be something that cannot be phenomenologically encapsulated in a circumscribable way, right? We're trying to account for that which resists description. And that's always going to be non-foundational, but it's functioning foundationally, not as thing or object or logical principle, but it is functioning as the springboard from which we make sense of the story that we are telling the best we can, right? He continues, do I feel the other? Oh, interesting. Or do I know of the other to derive from knowledge of the consequences of my required behavior? Yeah, this is tricky. So Levinas is not a sentimentalist. So he's not appealing to like moral sentiments like we would find in some other theorists, especially in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. He's not suggesting that we simply appeal to our feelings, because remember, our feelings can be radically deceived by our desire for power, right? And so if we give too much weight to our moral sentiments are likely to be misguided because of our egoism and the context in which that plays out, right? However, can I have knowledge of the other? This is a tricky spot. I think yes. Aaron Simmons thinks yes. Lots of folks would say no, because the face of the other is not a phenomenon, right? It's not an object. It's not knowable internal to intentional consciousness, because remember, I can't ever see the face. I can only see the nape of the neck and the raised eyebrow. The face is the depth dimension that somehow signifies, think about like Marion and saturated phenomena, right? It's the excessive depth dimension showing forth in what is presented. Yet I think we can have knowledge, but the reason I think we can have knowledge is because I am an externalist relative to knowledge acquisition and theories of justification, and I am actually a modest foundationalist internal to epistemic justification. So do I think we can be modestly foundationally justified in affirming the account we get of the face of the other? Yes. Does that mean if this is actually the case somehow, not again in an ontological descriptive way of there being a face somewhere, but if this is somehow the structure of subjectivity, if that turns out to be true, well, then it turned out to be true and I was justified in believing it, and therefore it could be said to be knowable in a kind of broadly Alstonian or Plantingian, Wolsterstorfian sort of way. But yeah, you're very welcome, Andres, saying thanks. I want to make clear that here's where my kind of nod to analytic epistemology is not just lip service. Like I'm deeply committed to one of the great blind spots of continental philosophy broadly, but especially a kind of existential deconstructivist hermeneutic space, is we tend to abandon epistemology as just being an outmoded outgrowth of metaphysics that we've now like gotten past. But ostensibly, the only way you could do that is because you've got an argument for why that's best left behind. And so if you're going to have an argument, clearly you've got good reasons, and those have got to be justified. Like, so let's actually do freaking good epistemology to defend the views that we hold as continental deconstructive philosophers, right? And this is where I will admit lots of continental philosophers do not like my going there. John Caputo, a good friend of mine, Jack, suggests that I settle for an abridged version of postmodernism precisely at these moments. And the abridgedness is I'm not fully open to the kind of wildness and untamed possibility of, you know, the aporia. And I want to say, all right, but then you've got to argue that the aporia is untamed in these ways. Like, so I'm a holdover, you might say, of somebody who really likes analytic philosophy of religion and pretty robust epistemological debates, but I defend the views articulated by existential phenomenology as I think the best account we have for what we find to be true in the world.
I do have I'd like to bring it back to Kant, if that's okay.
It always comes back to Kant, right? Isn't that the that's got to be the name for your kind of indie rock band? You know, back to Kant. Yeah.
Oh, the t-shirts we could make.
Right.
I think this critique of his notion of freedom is spot on. And the pitfalls of universalization. I wonder about Kant's religious writings. Are there some parallels between Levinas and his message here of faithfulness and what we might find within a religious community in Kant of transcending radical self-love and finding a place to concretely address radical evil?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that when it comes to any practical suggestion about what it would look like to live in community as historically embodied vulnerable relational beings, there are lots of places where we might find inspiration. I think Levinas is unlikely to be one of them for very long. So again, I think what Levinas does is gives us these kinds of structures. But for what it's worth, like I then go to people very boringly, like I'm going to lose all my postmodern sexy cred. Like I go to John Rawls about like what comprehensive doctrines look like and why we bracket them relative to pluralist discourse. And I go to Martha Nussbaum about how capabilities functions as a pretty interesting way of making sense of others in practical ways. And, you know, Chantal Mouffe's notion of radically plural democratic deliberation and Habermas's account of like an ideal rationality that doesn't actually appeal to an ontology, but it's kind of good practice. Like, so I don't think that there's any reason to foreclose possible resources for actual productive community enrichment. Kant's theory of religion might be a really robust site. And so for people who find that to do that work, I think that's fantastic. For myself, my worry about it, right? So make sure anybody hears this. Like what I'm not saying is, oh, that's a bad idea. I'm saying that's a great idea. Write that book. I want to read it. Where my initial, I don't know, is when Kant talks about religion most explicitly, right, in his so-called fourth critique, or you know, religion within the bounds of pure reason, the motivational move to this kind of transcending self-love is still because what we really recognize is the capital R status of reason. And that, like, ultimately, I think Kant's God is reason. And this is the kind of stuff that I would never put in print without like lots of footnotes, or Open Mike Eagle puts it, you know, lots of qualifiers. But I do. I think Kant is not interested in, again, what I'm calling a kenotic model of human existence, which I identify within Christianity. not in some sort of like radically exclusivist way, but in a just personal historical way, right? And so for me, when I appeal to like the story of Jesus, what I'm not saying is, let's pack the Supreme Court and get rid of abortion rights. What I'm saying is, man, wouldn't it be cool if it's true that the God of reality is maximally expressed in radical, self-humbling love that ruptures the structures of social power in the name of the outcast, the marginalized, the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and stranger? Like, that's pretty badass, right? So notice that structural move is very anti-Kantian, right? Because what Kant's doing is actually turning the other direction. So there is a kind of self-evacuation of it all being about me in the name of this kind of transcendent, community of love. But it's because what we really recognize, right, it is this invitation to rationality as a investment in what overrides all of us. And I would rather look at something that doesn't override all of us, but something that maximally gets expressed in all of us in our radical embodiment, radical, humanness. Andreas is saying reason's not the same thing as Vernunft, more like Sanskrit manas, whereas Vernunft comes close to Bodhi. I can't speak to Sanskrit. I don't have a background in that. I will say, though, it may be the case that in Kant's later work, there is a more dynamic way of making sense of his accounts of, Vernunft in relation to Verstand. I think if we read it, though, in a really consistent way with his early critiques, there is a kind of overflowing dimension, which maybe is what Andreas is getting at, right? Because remember, the God, freedom, and immortality, like these are the ideas of reason that radically go beyond what can be reducible to my cognitive functioning of relationships between parts and wholes, et cetera, right? And my causal connections within my cognitive apparatus. That's true. But the ideas of reason, I don't think, end up leading to some sort of, and here I may be misunderstanding because I am just not as expert in the background here, but I don't think it ever gets us to anything like a kind of apophatic self-emptying. I think it really more gets us to a kind of self-fullness in relationship to the grandeur by which we make sense of this being part of us, which we see especially in his theory of the sublime, where reason shows up as this tension between the humility of being overwhelmed by a cognitive intuition, a mountain range, say, but also then being elevated and having the feeling of respect, because though I'm overwhelmed by this mountain range, I can't intuit all of its detail. Nonetheless, I can make sense of the fact that I can't. And that then elevates me to appreciate my own rational nature. And what I really respect is not the mountain range, but the reason that is part of my cognitive apparatus. For me, that's, again, a great resource for those who can make that work. I think that's awesome, and I would do nothing but applaud it. It's probably not where I would go, just because, again, it seems like you'd have to do some work to avoid the temptation of making this look like self-aggrandizement, just in a slightly less vulgar way than I've got a Mercedes that's more expensive than your Mercedes, right? It's not that, but I worry that it doesn't fundamentally rupture that logic.
I am so glad that Andreas brought up Vernunft, because when you cautioned about that overlap between Kant's religious writings and what's happening here in Levinas, that sort of beholdenness to the God of reason as Kant construes it, Husserl gives a critique of that and bases his whole distinction between Rationalität and Vernunft. And so even though Husserl in his own ways is very much beholden to reason proper, at least we do see the mythical construction of the faculties and the categories and the concepts and how they fit together so orderly. Um, so I can get down with that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's a, in very technical senses, there's a mythos to Kant's account that I think Husserl is trying really hard to strip away. I mean, in some ways, you might say Husserl is a demythologized Kant, right? He's like, Boltzmann to Kant's Barth or something. And it's weird though, because in that sense, I think, again, like, even though Levinas is deeply drawing on Husserl, even though Levinas will say that he is deeply resonant with, he says that we have a deep affinity for Kant, because what is Kant saying? Everyone counts as an end in themselves, right? And so he's saying, yeah, this is in a very close affinity to what I'm saying, right? But let's be careful, because the justification for it is then going to be something that maybe is not fully up to the task of overcoming the temptation that is likely to then overrun. And I would suggest, this is why I'm so solidly convinced that everything that's right about existentialism and phenomenology reduces to the idea that, and this is again very, very grotesquely superficial, but I think it's true, it all reduces to the idea that success is ultimately an existential failure, but faithfulness is an existential invitation, right? And that doesn't mean that we then stop, pursuing goals any more than we say, well, Kant's useless, right? I am going to go mountain biking tomorrow morning. I have a goal of riding about 20 miles up in Pisgah National Forest with some friends and then going to get lunch afterward. Like, I want to pull that all off, right? There's this one drop on upper Black Mountain that I'm hoping to hit, because I always chicken out when I get to it, and like, these are success goals. But the point is, if I don't, like, it's not a thing that like now wrecks who I am. It's like, shoot. All right, next time I'm gonna freaking get that jump. Like, it becomes a thing we can do, right? But notice how we start expanding these success goals and becoming definitive of who we are. It becomes, I want to get the PhD so I can get the job, so I can get the partner, so we can get the family, so I can get the status, so I can get the. We've just rewritten Post Malone. It's the same effing song, right? It's just, instead of talking about 720s, we're talking about tenure. Woo! Like, it's the same story, right? I walk through the APA, all the people saying, wow, like, it's the same move. And I'm convinced that this is a bad move. Now, do you want to write books that people find helpful? Yeah, of course we do. Like, so it's not that don't have goals, don't pull off things, don't accomplish things. I want to minimize poverty and achieve racial justice and find universal health care. Let's do it. But the problem is, if we do it and then take a victory lap that never ends because, look at us, right? Now we've missed the whole point, which is there's still someone or some other we've forgotten. There is injustice that continues. Like, so it's that idea of saying, don't be defined by the goals, set goals, but be somebody. This is a sports metaphor, but like, don't just change the score, change the game, right? And I think that Kant ultimately is really, really, really game changing in relation to what we had, from kind of pre-modern philosophy. But let's not forget that modernity is where we still find ourselves fundamentally, defined by capital R reason and objective capital T truth and all those big ideas. It just doesn't look that way. It now just looks like capital M money, right? And capital I influence. So that framework, it's not surprising that the kind of birth pangs of the modern that Kant in many ways inaugurates would not also be potentially corruptible by now the great excesses of modernity. And that's where I think we've just got to be kind of careful. And again, this is why I'm also saying, be careful with Levinas. Like, there's a guy named Alford who wrote a great essay where he says we've got to be careful of the Levinas effect, which is basically the idea that we take Levinas and think he can speak to every problem perfectly. And my version of that is, it's not the Levinas effect, it's whoever you studied in grad school effect, right? It's whoever is your favorite person, like that person solves all the problems. And so it's like, oh no, Deleuze, if we just read more Deleuze, oh, well, I mean, but if you read more Bataille, like, this seems like an utterly stupid game for us to be playing in a world where people are dying from starvation every day, right? A better game is the one that says, look, here's why Bataille speaks to me. Here's why Deleuze helps me think we should be better at living. Now let's freaking go do that. And that can look lots of different ways. Maybe it looks like a Kantian religious community. Maybe it looks like a Levinasian team of marathon runners, like whatever. There's lots of ways to do it. What matters is, are we actually fundamentally invested in the vulnerable relationality that defines our historical embodiedness? And if we are, I got no beef with you. You know, it's like, cool, let's tag team on this one, because at the end of the day, we're not going to pass universal health care unless we somehow find a way to get Joe Manchin on board. Like, Christian cinema is annoying, and yet I kind of need the vote. Like, at some point, there's got to be a way to find the ground that lets us work together. And if we're not going to do that, we will, like that great movie, That Thing You Do, the Tom Hanks movie about the Oneaters, the Wonders, where they're like this one-hit wonder, where the lead singer like hates all the fame and the whatever. And so the Steve Zahn character is the bass player, gets mad at him. And he says, all right, go back to your hotel room, write that hit single, Alone with My Principles. Right. So we can all write that hit single, not pull off very much, and be really proud of the fact that we quoted Levinas better than the rest of them. I think that's just kind of dumb. And to be honest, this is why I fish a lot, because it turns out like you can mountain bike and fish with people you disagree with. But the relationships that get built are the ones that then require you to have to rethink your smugness. The people that will help you get to the ER and the people who will cut the, lure out of your thumb are people who may really disagree with you about stuff in the world. And so finding a way not to set aside the disagreement, but to see the face in the midst of it seems like a really good strategy.
Amen.
There you go. You'll start going into the backbeat. We'll have Zachary playing the double bass. Boom, 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 boom. So I'm actually Pentecostal. So if you really drop into that gospel backbeat, I may start running. So you gotta be careful. And this is where it went off the rails. It's not always that you can pinpoint when the philosophical conversation needs to adjourn to the after party, but that might be where it is.
When we start going, Levinas just said, shagadan, daga,
right?
We're done.
That's right. Well, this has been so much fun. You all are doing the kind of work that I wish more people did, and I'm honored to be invited to think with you about how to do this sort of work. And so I'm learning from you all, and a fan of, this difficult, messy stuff that we call public philosophy.
Thank you so much. You are invited back anytime to promote whatever work, whatever projects, whatever insights, whatever music you want.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. Yeah, very insightful.
Yes.
Thanks so much to all of you. And Andreas, thank you for your comments and questions too. I know you don't have a microphone, but I would love to hang out and get a drink with you and to hear more about, Sanskrit and mantras and stuff. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. And I've had a few emails of folks who had to drop out for various reasons, work calls or something happened. But they are all excited for this YouTube video to come up. So I'll get that up either tonight or tomorrow, depending on how long the computer takes. But we'll get that out there and out to everybody. And so there's much love coming from the community to you, Dr. Simmons. I
appreciate it. And yeah, when you drop it, send it to me and I'll push it on my end. And like I say, we'll help each other as much as we can. So
yeah, I'm very interested in that text you're talking about that's coming out, the Camping with Kierkegaard one.
Hey, thanks so much. Yeah, it's my first attempt to write for a popular audience at the book level. And so it is coming out with a press called Wisdom Works, should be out hopefully September, October. Okay. And I'll be pushing it hard. Obviously, when it comes out, I'm going to figure out my marketing side hustle. and just ignore all of the Harry Frankfurt I have read about how marketing is just bullshit, but I'm going to engage in it so far as I can. And yeah, it's a book. The question of the book is simply, what is worthy of your finitude?
Okay.
And the answer to that question is, I don't know, but whatever it is, do it faithfully.
Okay.
And so the subtitle, Camping with Kierkegaard, Essays on Faithfulness as a Way of Life. And so I draw on Kierkegaard, on Levinas, on Sartre, on Beauvoir, on Anne Lamott and Maya Angelou, and on and on and on and on and on. But not in a way that's trying to like get people to smuggle in philosophy. It's actually a way of like letting these names just be conversation partners as we walk through the mountains and fish on the rivers. So there's chapters. I have a whole chapter about the Cheers theme song, about wanting to go to a place where everybody knows your name and all of the problems are the same. A whole chapter on, what's it mean to be known by the other? And a chapter where I go walking with Thoreau and talk about different forms of aloneness that the mountains occasion. And a chapter about fishing called Of God and Trout Fishing, which is all about different kinds of hope we cultivate. And then the book has a chapter about ethics called Ethics on the Trail, which is all about mountain biking, what we learn from bikers. And then a final chapter that's talking about the other side of the mountain, which is all about Derrida and Heidegger on being towards death and learning to live finally. So it's a existentialism book, but hopefully written in a way that will appeal to anybody who thinks there's something missing in life if it's just about getting more. And especially if you like the mountains, it'll speak to you. But if you're like my wife and think mountains are dumb and the beaches are where we should go, hopefully it speaks to that as well, because it's not about choosing what I choose. It's about choosing on purpose to be faithful, to become the person that you want to be, and doing this in a way that is aware of finitude. So yeah, I'm stoked. Hope it comes out soon. When it does, I'll certainly let you know. We can maybe do a launch event or something together. It'd be fun.
Yeah, it sounds phenomenal. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much, man.
One more question about faithfulness. We're talking about sorgfalt or
yeah, my sense of faithfulness here is not probably that sophisticated. What I mean by faithfulness is simply risk with direction. So there are lots of names we could give that, lots of terms and concepts that might fit. For me, it's purely the idea that the only way we live as existential beings is as risky beings. This is the vulnerability, but we are always directed. This is the relationality. And so the point is, we've got to be fully aware and invested and purposive about taking risk with direction in ways that then we're okay with the person we are becoming. And so I think there's, again, lots of technical ways we could cash that out. Smarter people than me probably would do a better job of it. For me, it's in this case really meant to be a specifically Kierkegaardian idea, but I am developing it alongside Kierkegaard, but trying to say, as I put it, there's a cloud of witnesses that all kind of hang out thinking in this same general space. And that's what I'm calling existential philosophy. And yes, Andreas, the As a Way of Life is a direct reference to Pierre Hadot. And in fact, I had the honor years ago of translating an essay by Hadot on Thoreau, which is quite a mouthful, and got a lovely letter from Hadot, handwritten, which I think is just such a freaking cool thing, handwritten from him thanking me for translating this essay. And it always stuck with me that unless the ideas we propound can become ways of life worth our finitude, maybe we should hold different ideas. And so this is I've argued that stuff in technical ways for 20 years. This is my first attempt to do it with an eye toward like camping with my wife and telling the story about it getting down to 12 degrees and all of our stuff freezing and her never wanting to go to the mountains with me again. And, yet this is part of what is the strength of our relationship. And, stories about fishing with my dad and now him having neuropathy and prostate cancer, and what fishing together looks like differently, and how we kind of navigate this process of relational change. And so I hope it catches on, not because I again, them seeking the success. I hope it catches on, because I kind of think we've got to find ways to create a bigger lane for philosophy that is inviting us away from, like Post Malone. Like my attempts to say, hey, we can listen to Bus Driver and Aesop Rock and Rhapsody, but the only way to do that is if we find ways to kind of get more of that stuff in the hands of people, to kind of let them realize this is cool. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. So we'll see.
I'd like to second Andreas's thought in the chat is you rock.
I appreciate it. You guys are all too kind. And it has been my absolute pleasure to be with you. So yeah, look forward to more collaboration.
All right. Well, thank you everyone who participated today and who is watching at home. We thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.